Okay, today we're looking at the absolutely monstrous Dr. Z Z80. Now this amp has a really interesting background, and I want to tell you why I've got one of these, because it's not a brand that I'm particularly sort of had a lot of history with. I did have a Dr. Z Maz 18, and that's when I really discovered that those EL84 tubes are not exactly for me. They don't make the sound that I want. And I've gone through a couple of other amps with that sort of Vox tubing, so to speak, and just never quite got on with that sound. But I always wanted a Dr. Z amp. Now, a few months ago, I was on a long haul flight and I downloaded a load of YouTube videos. And for some reason, I downloaded about 20 or 25 of Dr. Z's videos from his channel. And I really like the guy. He's really endearing. It's very low key, down to earth. And he's a real sort of like old fashioned business owner. Do you know what I mean? Like his whole business and process looks like an old family firm, which I grew up in a family business, and just the way he was reminded me of people that I've known. And I like that. Very to the point, but warm. And I wanted to have something from Dr. Z. Now, one of the other videos was about the sort of evolution of this particular amp. Now, back in the early 60s, the Beatles were using Vox AC30s, but it got to the point where like the screaming crowds, well, basically you couldn't hear the amps over them anymore. So Vox knew that in order to compete with other amp manufacturers, like the Fender Showman was an 80-watt amp, and their biggest amp, the AC30, was 50 watts away from that. They knew they were going to need to make something. So they came out with the Vox AC80 100. Now, it was actually an 80-watt amp. They called it the 100, and it was a head that Paul McCartney used for his bass. And his one actually had a bass insignia on it, but otherwise they were sold without that, generally. Now, I've seen different numbers for how many were made, either 300 or a couple of thousand. I'm not 100% sure. But at some point, jumping forward 50 years, Brad Paisley got hold of one of these, and they're a bit of a unicorn mythical thing, these amps. So he was excited to use it and invited Dr. Z to a gig to hear it. Being they both loved the Beatles. And he then asked Dr. Z if he could make him another one, because the originals, the problem is they're not reliable. Now, this amp has 4 EL34 tubes, and each of them is individually cathode biased. And it just wasn't engineered to a point where it could withstand the heat. They would just melt down quite quickly. So Dr. Z spent 6 years going back and forward, making different iterations himself. Having Hayboer, who I know as a transformer maker because I do a little bit of amp making, one of the better or more well-known transformer companies. They made a custom transformer for Dr. Z for this. He made a new reinforced chassis and designed it so that it wouldn't overheat. So he's reined back the cathode biasing values, all sorts of things like that. The other thing is that the original didn't have a mid control. It had a fixed mid-range, and he's managed to put a mid control in. But otherwise, he wanted to get a similar feeling to that original amp. So he's tried to sort of make it in a way that gives as much homage to that amp whilst bringing it into the modern day so it's actually usable and can be used, night after night after night. Now, I love EL34 amps, and I was immediately interested. But the other thing is these amps are hand-wired by Dr. Z himself. He signed the back of it. And I wanted a piece of that. This is someone who I think will go down in amp making history. He's, gone a slightly different route to a lot of amp companies, and he's definitely on that Vox side of things and the train wreck side of things. And I like all of that, even though I never quite got on with the Vox sound. I've been wanting to have a Dr. Z amp that didn't follow that exact pattern. So in this video, I basically want to show you around the amp and show you a couple of sounds from it. One issue, I'm having to use an attenuator, the Fryette PS100, because my amp cabinet is 2x12 greenbacks, and you really need a 4x12 to handle the power without using the attenuator. But it also allows me to open the master up. Now, I did play it for 10 minutes before I plugged the attenuator in, and I had the master really low and the gain quite high, and it was fine. I don't think I would have blown any speakers at that volume. And it really wasn't as loud as I thought, with the master on a quarter and the gain volume on about 3/4. In the room, it was up to 105 decibels. So not as monstrous in a way as I thought. But it did feel a bit stiff. You know when you feel like the power section of an amp needs to open up? It did feel like that. So plugged the attenuator in and got it cooking. Now, it doesn't have any reverb, this amp, but it does have a fantastic effects loop. It has a Metro zero loss effects loop. That's Metropolis amps. I think they make an effects loop that's considered really good, and there's one of those in this amp. So I've plugged a reverb pedal in there. Now, I don't often use effects loops, but I'm starting to think I understand why people want them, right? Putting the reverb through the effects loop makes it feel pretty much like the amp has its own reverb, which is great. I'm a sucker for reverb, like most of us are, and it does make it feel nicer and easier to play. Now, I'm not going to do the comparison in this video, but I will in another one. I want to compare it to my Marshall type amps, so the Royalist and the vintage JTM 45 there. To me though, that sound was, I loved it. It was really full of grunt, just a little thump of low end, but not too much. And although it's a simple looking amp on the front, the gain controls seem to really do what you need to do. Whether you need to get that thump or if you want to sort of scoop it a little bit more or whatever. It's one of those where I don't feel the loss of all the tone sculpting things like you get on a 2-rock, you know, your boost switches and all your various other ways of doing it. This one goes the opposite approach. I mean, the original amp was simple. So like a Vox AC30 was way more complicated. It had loads of inputs and it had loads of transistors in it and everything. And they wanted to pair it back for the AC80. And it's a way less complicated amp. But the sweetness of having that cathode biasing per tube, and there's no negative feedback loop, so there's nothing like stopping it from getting more overdriven. You know, a negative feedback loop sort of makes the amp have more headroom or feel cleaner as you go up through the volume. This doesn't have that, right? So it's got that really sweet feeling, especially when you can push the master. Now, I don't think there's an issue using an attenuator with amps like this. Something I've been coming round to. I always wanted to try and just use what the amp has, the master volume and everything, but as I'm becoming more conscious of my ears and the fact that I want volumes to be a bit more realistic to what people will actually play at, I think the attenuator works well for that. And this Fryette one, if you don't know what it is, it has a tube inside it and it basically sort of reamps the amp in a way, giving it, to me, a better sound than the other sort of well-known attenuators that I've had in the past. So yeah. Now, a particularly sweet sound I thought I got from this was from the Telecaster. This is my Dale Wilson Dakota Red Tele, and it's got some bare Broad 5.0 pickups in, which are great. And we're going to hear it cleaner, and then we're going to hear it more dirty, and I'll show you the settings on the screen. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. Now, I always need to know what a Strat sounds like through an amp. Now, before I even do this amp I thought of to myself more as a Telecaster and humbucker sort of amp. It just felt like that to me, even thinking about it. So I was intrigued to see what the Strat would sound like. Let's see what we think. That was okay. I don't think it would be my go-to Strat amp, and it wasn't intended to be. So in my mind, there's something about Telecasters, humbuckers, country, you know, Brad Paisley, even though I don't play that style, I knew the amp would work well for those. So yeah, I'm not surprised that the Strat isn't at its absolute best in that. Not that it didn't sound good. I mean, if I was, you know, going to take this amp to play somewhere, I wouldn't not plug my Strat in just for that reason, but it's not the best amp for Strats. On the other hand, the Telecaster sounded so good to me, and then the SG was just, yeah, I love that. It was proper grunty. So yeah, that was great. Actually, I think I'm being a bit harsh there about the Strat thing. I was just listening back again on my computer, and it's not really that it's not as good with Strats as some of my other amps. It's just what I'm used to. So, you know, with a 2-Rock Classic Reverb or other Fender type amps, there's a certain, I don't know, more sort of bell-like clarity thing. But what I really like about this is the way when it's overdriven like that, there's just a lot of harmonic content and stuff that I'm not used to with a Strat, right? It's not the sound I've been used to, but actually I think it's pretty cool and something I could lean into for certain things. But yeah, this amp is, I think, something really interesting. I love the whole history and the reason why it exists. I like the fact that it's been made by people who have a passion project going, and it's great that someone like Dr. Z has hand-wired it himself. And that's one of the reasons why, for me, I think it's just a keeper. It's just something, I see it in the whole landscape of amps. Dr. Z, I think, has an important place. Over the last 20 or 30 years or whatever, he's been making amps that I think stand up really, really well. I think they're actually priced pretty well when you consider other boutique amp company prices, and considering how much bespoke work is in this one, the price wasn't bad at all. This was about $3.5 grand. So yeah, altogether, I'm really glad to have this Dr. Z here. You'll see more of it. You'll hear it with other guitars over time, as usual. But I hope you enjoyed this one. Now, I'm not sure exactly when this came out. It may be at the beginning of the new year. I made it just before Christmas. But either way, Happy New Year. It's probably around that time anyway. And I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.